Okay, cool. Alrighty. Cool. Looks like we're live.
Okay, very good.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Susie. I appreciate it. I wanted to
Absolutely.
give you the chance to just share a bit about yourself and what you've done and what you do, and tell me about you.
Okay. One of our favorite topics, right? Talking
Mm,
about ourselves. So I am currently a coach, coaching largely career professionals, people who are interested in making a job change, moving in a different direction, or someone who it feels like there's more. They feel unfulfilled and are interested in exploring what's next for them. But I did not start there. I started with a multi-decade corporate career, largely in communications, public relations. I worked in human resources some, did some marketing and customer service work, and also did some philanthropic work. And when I left my corporate role, I knew I was not finished, but I didn't want to go to another corporate role. And I pretty quickly connected with someone who had actually been a consultant for me when I was in the corporate role. And her organization did a lot of training and workshops around communications, how someone shows up, how they present themselves, executive presence. Also, I began working as an adjunct professor at a local university. It was something that I had done when I was getting my master's, and I loved it. And so I got a position teaching in the mass communications department at a local university. And there's a connection there to where I've ended up. And the work with the consulting and training work was very fulfilling. I loved it. What we found would happen is people that we worked with would come back to us and say, we have this person and they're high potential, but they're struggling. Can
mm,
you work with them? Or they would say, we have this person and I'm just not sure it's a good fit. Can you
hmm
work with them? And we always wanted to say yes, but what I realized pretty quickly is to do this work well, I needed some formal training and certification because this was not consulting work, this was coaching work. And I got my first coaching certificate through Gallup. I've always been an admirer of their strengths assessment. I think it's one of the best assessment tools out there, largely because it focuses on what you're great at, not what your weaknesses are. We tend to always go to the bottom. If you come home with a report card and you have 4 A's and a C, all the attention is on the C, not the 4 A's. And the Gallup Strengths really focuses you on what your natural talents are, what your natural strengths are. So that took me down a coaching path. And then when the pandemic happened and we had to flip the consulting work from in-person to virtual, I picked up even more coaching work, loved it, and realized that that really was the path that I wanted to pursue in earnest. And so I got my International Coaching Federation certification and have been doing largely coaching work since then.
Wow, it's quite a story.
It's a long and winding road.
There's something that stood out for me there, and I want to touch on the coaching and the work you're doing right now as well. But a question that I have is often a lot of people that leave corporate and then head to, doing their own thing. Maybe they start a small business. Maybe they do something completely different, do a complete 180. They often, and I'm not saying you were doing this, I'm just making observation of what I've seen from other people.
Yep.
They'll often talk about the restrictions on corporate and the negatives on corporate. The how would you say? They'll see corporate in a bad way. Now, for me, I tend to want to look at the dualistic nature of all things in life. There's positives and negatives. What are some things that you learned from the corporate world that have helped you? And overall, was it a positive experience working in a corporate company? Because for me, I've worked corporate, but I haven't worked like big corporate. I'm talking like maybe 300 people employee company, but not thousands, or not a bank kind of style. So I'd love to hear what the benefits are working there, if there were any.
Yes, many. I wouldn't have stayed for decades if I hadn't enjoyed it and loved the work. And so I worked for a Fortune 150 company. And
Wow.
so it was a big company. And a part of that, you get exposed to the best of the best and have a lot of opportunities. And in the role that I had, I was a counselor, an advisor, an unofficial coach to some of our senior leaders. So at times the work was not dissimilar to what I'm doing now. I just didn't have a certification and didn't have a shingle up, but I was coaching them on how to be better communicators, how to be better leaders, how to manage more effectively. Now, some of the downside, and it's what everyone says, it's bureaucratic, things move slow, a certain amount of rigidity. But what I have found in the coaching work that I do now, I'm coaching a lot of professionals. And while they work for different companies, many of the issues and challenges that they face are very similar and very familiar. So if I had been an entrepreneur my whole career, I don't know that I would be as equipped to coach someone who finds themselves in a large organization with some of the quirks, if you will, of a large organization.
Gotcha. And what are some of those, you mentioned helping people with common problems inside of leadership and both in entrepreneurialism and also in corporate structures. What are some of those common trends that you see, like with people that need your help, and what are they?
Work-life balance. That's often a thing, and it's especially interesting in the world that we live in right now, where many people are still working either completely from home or largely from home. That is a nuance, actually, that is somewhat new. It's not something that I face, because when I was in the corporate world, you went to the office every day. However, if you work for a big corporation, you're working with and talking with people in different cities, different states, different countries. So even pre-pandemic, pre-Zoom, you were having to connect with people who were not in the same place. The difference now is you may be sitting in the same city, but often you're not sitting in a common office. And so I think that is a challenge for people. How do I build my career? How do I establish myself? How do I show up when no one ever sees me in person, or rarely sees me in person? That's one of the things that I think people are facing. And it's also one of the other challenges is around leadership. New managers face some of the same problems that I faced when I was a manager. Every person that you're working with is different. what motivates them is different. And so how you reach different people different ways is something that is foreign to many people, and they have to think about, oh, what motivates Luke is different than what motivates Susie, so I approach them perhaps in slightly different ways.
Wow. So you got those three things: the work-life balance, being separate from the physical location of an office, and then also just leadership in general. And all those things there, because I'm running a business myself, and they all resonate, every single one of those ones. So all my team is remote. I've got a team of, I think, 7 or 8 now, and they're all remote. I'm kind of pushing that, freedom of time you want to work and freedom of location. And also everyone's different. I'm still quite young in my, how would you say, in my career, so to speak, of running a business. That's one of the things you learn at the start, right? Like you read books on leadership, and books are great and they're good perspective builders, but they need to be looked through the lens of critical thinking, which is, okay, this is someone writing a book at a certain time in their life for a certain context of person. Do I fit that context? And often so the answer is no. And that's why you have to be critical, right? And that's why coaches are a benefit, because they can kind of see the specific nuanced problems you might be facing. Is there any concepts or things out there that you see that people might be reading that's common in the leadership world that is perhaps, in your opinion, maybe incorrect? I know there's context that applies, but generally speaking.
Gosh, well, I'm not sure about reading, but there's a lot of talk, and you hear leaders of large companies, large financial organizations, and other organizations who say, come back to the office. Everyone should come back. And I think that's crazy. I think, and I think people who force that are going to lose great people. Now, there's some jobs that one of the companies that I've done a lot of work with, when they were bringing people back to work, they approached it 3 different ways. They run a retail business, so the people in the retail business never left the office, because the office is the storefront. Yeah. And those people had to be in place every day, all the time. Another group of people could be hybrid. They do a work that some of the work can be done from home, some of the work you need to be in the office. So they had a hybrid schedule. And the third was people who really did not need to be in the office. And the leadership and the human resources department put everybody in a bucket. But then you got to appeal your bucket. So if you felt like your bucket was incorrect, they let you make your case for how you need to work. I'll give a personal example. I mentioned to you that I teach at a local university. Well, pre-pandemic, I did everything in person. During the pandemic, everything went virtual. When we started having classes in person, I made the argument that my courses needed to be hybrid, because I teach a public speaking course. And I felt like it is as important for my students to know how to stand up at the podium and speak, but it's equally important that they be able to do what you're doing. Sit in front of a camera and make a presentation virtually, because that's the world they're going to live in. They'll have some in-person opportunities, they'll have some virtual opportunities. And I made that request and it was accepted. So I think just being across the board, everyone needs to be in person, is wrong. But there are some jobs that do require brainstorming, coordination, teamwork, that it makes sense to have some of that work in person, at least some of the time.
that spontaneity as well. You know, you have a hub of people bumping into each other, like, oh, did you hear about this idea? You kind of need that as well.
Absolutely. I don't know what you found with your team, but I had
Mm,
people who I was leading who would be in my office every day, multiple times a day. Hey, what about this? What do you think about that? What do you think about that? Then there are other people who
mhm.
would never, ever speak to me unless I made that happen. You know, they're doing their thing. They either didn't feel comfortable checking in or didn't want to interrupt. So it was on me to make that happen. Yeah, but that in-office interaction can be important. And I think for virtual workers, we have to think about, okay, how can I replace that? What can I do?
Yeah, because there is that element of, yeah, and also human connection as well. That's, you know, because I'm also working remotely because that's how the business is set up. It can get a bit lonely, you know, being at home and just chopping away working. And then there's no boundary of, you know, that work-life balance. So you're seeing a trend in, I'm sure you've observed this, which is
Yes.
people crave that freedom, but that freedom often gets turned on its head because you're sitting there working away and you're realizing that it's after hours. Well, my computer's right here. Versus, you know, say 40, 50 years ago, just in general, you would leave the office and that's done. You go home, you can have, you know, dinner with your family. Now it's like your laptop is right there, emails are coming through, and it's just extremely difficult from my own experience.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, it's interesting here in the United States, our Surgeon General says loneliness is an epidemic.
I've seen that recently, right? That's it's worse than smoking. In fact, or probably the
Mhm,
same, I think it was.
mhm. And I think some people think that means we have to be out and about together. And some of that is true, but if you do it well, you can do virtually really well. I have
Mm,
had sessions with some of the folks that I'm coaching where I literally forget we're not in the same room together.
wow.
I forget. Now, I don't know whether they forget, but I forget. I feel like we're so connected and it's working so well
Hmm.
that if you do virtual well, and if you really lean into it, it, I believe, can combat some of that isolation and some of that loneliness.
Wow. So I wanted to pivot a bit and ask something a little bit different, right? So there's you see with some of the more what's the word I'm looking for? Iconoclastic kind of characters in the business world, like you have your Elon Musk, your Steve Jobs, mainly just those two, right? And if you read their autobiographies and you read how they led or lack thereof,
Mhm.
they're both quite and each have their own perks and, you know, individuality, but they're both very blunt, very demanding, you know, all the examples of what a leader should be. They're quite the opposite of that. An
Mhm.
example of that specifically is there's, you know, I read I think it's Ashley Vance's autobiography on Elon Musk, and all the employees basically said that he was a tyrant. Like he was, obviously they were ex-employees as well, so they're biased. You know, they something could have happened, whatnot. But they said that he was very aggressive, very you know, like this needs to be done by this time. And then you'll read stuff on leadership. It's like, you know, listen, active listen, like just listen and pay attention, talk back to the person what their desires are. It's like compassion, you know, and the more kind of I guess you'd say feminine approach, right? Then you have Steve Jobs, who was you know, like this had this reality distortion field, and he was how would you say this can't be done by this date. Yes, it can, and they would like make his team work nonstop. So I wonder, you know, obviously everything has a nuance, right? There's you pick things from different parts. Like, what business are you in? You're in tech. Are you in this? I get the nuance, but I wonder why were these guys successful, and why should or why shouldn't someone follow their same leadership style?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. It's a very complicated question.
Yep.
So back in the day when I first became a manager, a lot of the training was more in the lines of, you are the manager and not leader, you're the manager, and very much top down. And I think what we've seen and what we've learned over time is that'll get results maybe for a while, but especially now, and especially with some of the younger generations, people won't stay. We've seen it. We've seen quiet quitting. We've seen active quitting. We have seen all of those things where people say, this is not how I want to work. This is not how I want to be led. And I think, we go back to understanding the differences in people. And with my Gallup hat on, understanding the strengths and talents of people really matters, because I have worked with people who really did want you to tell them very explicitly, I want these 3 things by this date. That's what they need. That's what they want. That feeds them. Then other people want you to say, here's the objective. Now figure out how we get there. If you reversed it, both people would be miserable and wildly unsuccessful. So I think as a leader, if you understand what your tendencies are, and then have an understanding of what your team and the members of your team need, you can be very successful. Great leaders are actually really good coaches. They ask more than they tell, because coaching is really about asking questions, and it's about eliciting thoughts and ideas. And great leaders do the very same thing. Now, it doesn't mean that a great leader doesn't have to listen, gather inputs, and then make a decision. But they make that decision with the inputs of the team. And hopefully, if the team or members of the team are not successful in advancing their ideas, they feel like at a minimum that they were heard and that they were considered. And one of the greatest leaders I worked with in my corporate career would say, when we were sitting around the table, her leadership team, she would say, we're going to discuss this. We're going to be very frank. But then when we make the decision, and I'll make the ultimate decision, we as a team are going to support that. And we did. I didn't always feel like my idea won, but I always knew I had been heard. I had been considered. And oftentimes, if my idea was not the idea that moved forward, I had a real good understanding of why. And then I can support that.
Yeah, so it sounds like the underlying tone is always one of being understood and being heard, because that's what we want as humans, right? We want to be heard.
Yes.
And for me, I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance, because I'm like, well, then why were these certain leaders in history so successful? And I'm not saying that I want to be them at all. I'm just curious because, and again, like this is more of a, if you were to do like the statistics or an equation and look at like, okay, across time, you had more compassionate, understanding leaders versus these types who won, quote unquote, based on, say, successful business on an average of income or something like that. Who won the most? Across the average, you might find that, well, you probably would find that it was more the leaders that listened, that paid attention, that were good coaches. So I guess there is that there as well. But it's alarming to some people who are, starting a business, who want to have that kind of that leadership style because they think it works, when really just outliers, right?
Right. I also think a couple of things, just using Steve Jobs and Elon Musk as examples. Elon Musk is more recent, but Steve Jobs was in a different time, in a different era. And I also think that leaders like Steve Jobs surround themselves with people who maybe bring things to the table that they don't. So Steve Jobs is the visionary.
Mhm.
He is the high achiever. He wants it done yesterday, and nothing is impossible. And I suspect if you looked around his leadership team, there were people who brought things to the organization that he didn't bring, who
Mm.
had maybe had a bit of empathy, who maybe had a little bit of less
Patience.
of, yeah, a little bit of patience, and maybe could push back on him a bit.
Mm.
I don't know that, but that would be my hypothesis. And again, that's a thing that I think great leaders do. They know what they're great at, they know what they're not great at, and they surround themselves with people who help course correct for their blind spots, because we all
Mm.
have.
Yeah, wow. And that's the other part of this as well. It's like, so far, great leaders are great coaches because they listen, they ask questions, they understand. And what I'm hearing so far is they know their strengths and weaknesses.
Mhm. Yes.
Perfect.
Right. The best leaders, I believe, are very self-aware. There's
Mm.
some who are not. We can all think of some who are not, who are up on a pedestal. Everyone tells them they're great. Everyone tells them they're brilliant, and they don't
Mm.
know what their blind spots are. But I believe that the best leaders do. They know what they're not great at.
Mm. So I guess it comes down to, I don't know if I believe in this as a thing, but emotional intelligence, right? It
Yeah.
comes down to emotional intelligence. So in your, like, there's the 5 things of emotional intelligence. There's the self-awareness, the self-regulation, there's the empathy element or the social intelligence element, and a few others that I forget now from Daniel Goleman's book. How does one cultivate emotional intelligence from your experience?
So I'm going to lapse into strength speak again. And it's
Please.
knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I'll give you a personal example. Empathy is one of the Gallup talents. It is not in my top 15. It's not in my top 20.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a naturally empathetic person. And probably some of the people who I've worked with would say that's correct. But it's really interesting when I read my student evaluations and when I get feedback from the people I coach. One of the words that they use a lot is she cares so much. She wants this to happen. And I'm not faking that. But what I am doing is taking things that are talents of mine and using them. So one of my top 5 talents is learner. I'm naturally interested in people. So when I want to hear about them, when I want to, and I'm strategic, I like to problem solve. So
Mm.
when I'm hearing from someone about a problem, about a challenge, about something they're facing, I want to learn about it and I want to work with them to help solve for that. That looks and feels like empathy to them. I'm not laying awake worrying about their problem like someone with deep empathy might.
Mm.
I'm about solving it. As one of my colleagues said to me, Susie is not the person who you want to cry on her shoulder, but she is the person you want to help you figure out what you're going to do about what you're crying about. And so I think again, it's that understanding of here's where I naturally go. Here's how I naturally respond, and how can I leverage that or dial that up and down
Mm.
in this particular situation.
And that rings true for me as well. It's like, because that's exactly what you said there. It's like those two traits of problem solving um and wanting to discover what that is. Like, why is it not working this way? People are like, oh, they care. And which, to a degree you do. And here's the thing, right? There's a resistance of like, oh, like like you have no empathy whatsoever. But I hear you in that, because I'm always asking my team for feedback. It's like, what's not working for you guys? What's not working? And they feel like very connected when I ask that, but I'm just wanting to solve the problem. It's not a good or bad thing. It just is what it is. I think it's a good thing, actually, but I relate to that. Yeah, but I don't sit up at nighttime thinking about like the problems of that. I mean, there is stress there for sure on the workload, but not so much around that. So I hear that.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm. So in your mind, there was one of the questions that I wanted to go through. What is the difference between, I'm tempted to say a counselor, but let's go with psychologist, between having a psychologist and a coach?
Very different. Now, when I say that, coaching can feel therapeutic, but it is not therapy in the traditional sense. We don't look at trauma. We don't spend a lot of time looking back. How did you become this way? What happened to you? It is more forward looking. And so sometimes people need a coach and a therapist. But sometimes, more often than not, you need one or the other. So I would say, if you have deep trauma in your life, if you've experienced terrible things that are impacting your today, you probably need a therapist. If you are exploring life changes, professional opportunities, if you feel stuck, a coach might be the answer.
That's huge, because, and that's going back to that key trait you mentioned there, which is self-awareness, right? Such a huge thing. If someone's going to sit there and think to themselves, like, I'm really struggling with this next career move, because it's been so drummed in our culture to see a psychologist, like that's the only thing. When you really step back, it's like, I'm actually going through a shift in what I want to do, and what I actually need is clarity around the strategy. And I'm not very good at strategizing, so I need someone to help me do that. Or, like, it's, say, for example, you're a more agreeable person, so to speak, and you want to ask for that pay rise. You can definitely see a psychologist, but I imagine someone who's a career coach who's dealt with that specific issue multiple times over many years would have the answers. So I think that's really important.
And I think what's really important, and I'm going to make a distinction between a coach and a therapist, and a coach and friends. I sometimes have people say, well, I'll just talk to my friends about that. Okay, your friends are probably going to tell you what to do. He's a bad influence, let him go. A coach is not going to do that. A coach is going to pull the thread by asking you questions, and you find the answers that are within you all along. Someone that I was coaching described it to me, and I thought it was a beautiful analogy. She said, it's like I had this ball of spaghetti in my head, and we straightened it out. And so the coach is not going to answer the questions for you. The coach is going to ask you the questions that help you find the way, find the path, find the answers that are right for you.
That's beautiful. I love that. Huge distinction there between psychologists, therapists, and coaches. So I love that. I want to add a few questions that came through before that came back to me. And the first one is, do you have any specific tips for those people listening out there to cultivate a work-life balance? It could be super macro or super micro.
Yeah. It's it's so hard. And I would say that through the course of my life, I have not been the role model for this.
Mm.
Um, when I think about well-being, which is a topic that's kind of buzzy today, there are a number of aspects, well, there are really 5 aspects to well-being. There is your career, there's your financial, there is your social, your community, and your physical. And they are like connected pieces of a pie.
Mm.
Because if you are having financial problems, you're not going to be your best at work. If you can't sleep at night, you're not going to be your best at work. If you have no social, you're experiencing that loneliness, you're not going to be your best at work. And they even merge a little bit, because work and community can be connected. Often work groups volunteer together, they do community engagement type things together. I think many of us who have big careers would often say some of our best friends are our work friends. So there's an overlap between work and social. But if any of those pieces of pie are out of balance, it's impacting everything. Now, where it gets a little complicated is everyone's pie is divided differently.
Mm.
So if you're an introvert, your social piece of the pie is not as big as someone who's an extrovert. But you still need a little piece of social in your pie. It just may be a smaller sliver than someone who's very extroverted. And so when I think about balance, I think about all 5 aspects and periodically doing a self-check to say, where am I? Financial's good. Don't need to worry about that, but I need to come back and look at that because it could get out of whack, and I need to service that if it does. Where are my gaps? Is one of the pieces of pie getting too big? Often it's that career piece of the pie that gets too big. We don't have time to exercise because we're working all the time. We never to put the laptop down. We're always on the phone. And it's really doing that check, that audit, and then asking yourself, okay, I have a gap. What am I going to do about that? And setting a realistic goal for what you're going to do about it. If you haven't exercised in a month, saying you're going to run 4 miles every day, probably not going to happen. So taking baby steps. And you can build a habit in 30 days.
Mm.
So it's almost giving yourself a 30-day challenge of I'm going to make progress in this area. If I haven't seen my friends in 6 months, I'm going to reach out. We're going to get together next week. Then maybe I'll reach out to a friend I haven't spoken to in 2 years. Whatever those things are, be reasonable, be realistic, and commit to 30 days. And then assess it in 30 days and scale up. If you walked around the block, now walk around 2 blocks. I'm being extreme, but you get the point.
I hear you. I think that's the nuance there around habits, because you read books like James Clear's Habit Book, and then he's talking about obviously there's more to it. It's a whole book, but the concept people get from it is I can create a habit in the 21 days or the 28 days or whatever it is, not realizing that just because it says you can create a habit doesn't mean that it's the best one that's going to lead you to the life that you want. And to tie that all in, let's say, for example, you want to have a critical mass in your net worth of $100,000. You wouldn't then, do that in 1 month. You might start with, okay, for this first month, I'm going to put $5 aside every single day, or $5 a week, or even $5 every fortnight, right? If that's what, if you're in a bad situation, it's like you got to start somewhere. Or it's like 5% of my income I'm going to do. You won't notice that, right? And the next month it might be 10%. Then the next month might be 15. So you want to kind of gradually increase that it's like habit stacking in a way. And it's like having a clear, and that all comes down from the end goal. It's like, well, why do you really want that $100,000? What are you going to do with it? If someone said to me like, well, I've read that, the annual return is 9.2% across the last 20 years, then great. I'm going to use that as a way to passively live off my income and bring in some more extra money. That's different to, I want to go on a vacation, so I think that, and for me, it's always been a bit of an iffy thing. Like goals feel, for me, I'm very, my personality is very rigid. Like I like to, if I do something and I set out goals, I won't just set the goals. I'll then like print off a habit tracker, then I'll do all these things. And the downside for that, for me, is that I then become so rigid that I stifle my own self. It's like I've tied my shoelaces up too tight and I'm uncomfortable with my feet. So I'm like, oh, get this off me. So I kind of have
you've also added an additional stressor.
Correct.
You set out for this goal because you felt out of balance, but now you've added a layer of stress. I must do this, which defeats the purpose of the goal.
Precisely. So it's like this kind of snaking its own tail in a way, like you're going around this weird circle. So for me, like, and here's the thing, right? And this is why and I've said this multiple times now, people probably overhearing it, but it's like everything is so specific when it comes to certain situations, and some things are general, right? But when it comes to like, for me, goals, I don't like to touch goals too much anymore because I've done it in the past. And like you said, then it's led to that. And maybe it's something you could share there. Like, is there anything that people who are type A's, rigid, like the down the little detail, they start measuring like cents, all these kind of things and whatever it is there any advice for them? Should they set goals? And if they do, is there any parameters?
Yeah, I think it's knowing yourself, like you said. And sometimes I find that people think they should, so they feel that there's a gap. So what do I mean? I think I should be running every day because it feels like healthy, balanced people run every day.
That's huge.
But if that doesn't feed you, if running, I walk. I don't run, I walk. And I watch people running. And I have a theory, and I can't prove it, that there's some people who are miserable runners. They're miserable.
I agree.
You can see it. Then there are other people who I can see their endorphins have kicked in, their stride is lovely, and they are loving this. And I think that's an analogy for a lot of things. We take on things because we think we should, but we really don't need that. We won't enjoy it. It doesn't relieve stress. It's just another thing I have to do. So when you're looking at your balance and you're feeling that things are out of balance, one of the questions I would ask is, if you look at those 5 pieces of the pie, it's okay if some of your pieces are really small, but is there a piece that's really small and that makes you sad? Not guilty, sad. And if it makes you sad, if it makes you feel incomplete, then think about, what can I do about that? What are some simple steps I can take?
That's a huge distinction between guilty and sad, because guilty means that I ought to do this. Sad is like I want to do that and I'm missing
I
out on it.
missed this. Yeah, I
Mm,
missed this. Mhm.
mm. I think that comes from, that I don't want to label a whole space, and I think a lot of people practice it. And I think it has its utility, but I feel like a lot of this, you should be doing this, and you can change how you think about this mentality, comes from the kind of Tony Robbins-esque era. And great, and like I love his work. I love what he's doing, and there's definitely value there. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it comes from this like NLP kind of vibe of just change how you think about it. Like, turn the brightness up in your head of how you view it, or, become more visual instead and visualize you enjoying it. It's like we've fell out of touch with the intuition that drives the things that we enjoy in our life. And I've seen this for myself a lot recently. And as you get, I'm 28 years old, so I'm still quite young, but as we get older, we start to just not tolerate BS anymore.
Right.
An example of that in my life is, and I still love doing this stuff. It's all about the context it's in. I used to read science articles and then go through them and summarize them, and read all this technical stuff and buy these huge books on neurochemistry and the brain and all those kind of things. And then I just stopped enjoying it. I just didn't. I remember reading it. I'm like, I don't want to read this anymore. Just stop. I'm like, no, I got to finish the book. Got to stay committed. Finish the book. And just recently, like if I buy a book and I don't like it, now for the first time in my life, for the last like 3 weeks, I won't make myself feel bad about it. Like, I don't like this. I just stop listening to it.
Good for
And
you.
yeah, and then but what's really fascinating me at the moment is modern history, like World War II, World War One, like just the intricacies of that. And I'm reading a 40-hour book at the moment. I'm reading 2 books simultaneously, and can't get enough of it. Like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, and I know that feeling of like, I have these cues in my brain. Like, do I want to, is a first instinct when I'm making my dinner or when I'm doing something that I want to listen to this audiobook? Do I want to go to bed because I want to read this book? Do I have those cues there? And if I don't, I'm like, I don't like this book. And every single time I'm in the middle of doing something, I'm like, oh, I want to listen to this book. Or before I go to bed, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to spend an hour reading this book. So I've stopped doing that, where it's like, but then in the context of making, say, a YouTube video, I'm more than happy to go through and read science articles and make a script based on that. So I've just had this huge like kind of shift in my life of just being like, it's probably the wrong wording, but less tolerant towards things that I don't enjoy.
Yes. I think that's great. And I think we should all do more of that. There's certain things that we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
We have to pay taxes. We have to because the consequences are very significant. If you don't, you'll go to jail, or they'll cut off your electricity. So there's certain have tos, but sometimes we label things as have tos that really aren't have tos. They may be shoulds. I should know about the history of World War II, but life is short.
Mm-hmm.
And if that doesn't feed you, if it doesn't make your life better, if it doesn't help you do your job, if it doesn't bring you satisfaction, interest, passion, should become could. I could, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, and a lot of those insights of, or those end results of me choosing to do something came from how would you say, from the realization of my own finitude. Like, I only have a certain amount of hours in my day. I literally can't do everything. All these, I can't be like an engineer and also a business owner and also this and also this. Like, who do I really want to be? Like, what is at the core of who I want to be? And it's like, if you know the answer, I think the answer is often stepping back and letting that inkling or that feeling, which again is a self-awareness thing. It's the meta-awareness, the awareness of the awareness, to step in and to allow you to do the things that you want to do. Then everything becomes intentional.
Yes.
but not in the kind of way of I am going to schedule my day from the moment I wake up to the time I go to bed. If I don't do those things, then I haven't succeeded. Not that kind of intentional. I mean, like, following the rhythms of your own intuition, so to speak. And then from there
Yes.
comes an enjoyable life, I think.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And if more people would do that, we would be happier. We would be happier. We would be mentally, physically well.
I agree. Absolutely. And also speaking on is it the running thing when someone's running? That is definitely true. I see that all the time around here. People are running and they think that they ought to do it, right? It's like I saw this, the Nike ad or something. It's like running. It's this program feeling. So I hear you on that. So where can people find you? Speaking about happiness and
Yes.
leadership and whatnot, where can people find you? Where should they reach out to you and all that stuff?
Sure, sure. My website is carolinassociates.com,
Mhm.
CAROLIN and then associates, not two A's, one A.
Lovely. And
And
I'll
my
put that in the
email,
notes.
my email is sadams@carolinassociates.com.
Beautiful. All right. I'll put
And
that in the
I
show
would
notes as
say,
well.
yeah, wonderful. And I would say if someone is interested in learning more about coaching, I do complimentary discovery calls. I talk about coaching in general, and if someone's interested in exploring working with me, more specifics about that.
Lovely. Thanks for your time today. And thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank